Hello, everyone. Welcome to the webinar series on infrastructure and PPP financing. I'm Shyamala Shukla, Senior Consultant with the Public-Private Partnerships Group of the World Bank. This webinar series is jointly brought to you by the Leadership Learning and Innovation Group and the Public-Private Partnerships Group of the World Bank. Today's webinar is the second in this series, and our topic for today is What's New in India? Examining Public-Private Partnership Financing Trends. We have with us today two very distinguished speakers. The first speaker will be Sharmila Chavli, Joint Secretary, Infrastructure and Energy in the Department of Economic Affairs in the Ministry of Finance in India. We also have with us today Benedict Eidbergen, the Program Leader for the World Bank for India. Both of them have immense experience in this area of PPP financing. Sharmila is, of course, working as a Joint Secretary, Infrastructure and Energy, looking after all the infrastructure sectors, including the power sector in India. She has a long experience in PPP financing, in PPP policy, as well as working on project management and public procurement. Before her tenure in the Ministry of Finance, she worked as a executive director in the Railway Ministry. She was on the Railway Board, also again looking after infrastructure and public-private partnerships in the railway sector. She also works as director on the board of the IIFCL, which is a 100% government-owned company which provides infrastructure debt financing. And she has been working as director ADB. In fact, we worked together in my tenure as Director Infrastructure. I worked together with Sharmila, who was Director in charge of the Asian Development Bank, which was financing some very important large infrastructure projects in India. It was a pleasure working with her, and it's a pleasure, Sharmila, to see you back today over here with us. And we are waiting to hear from you on your take on what's happening in India, the recent trends. And to introduce Benedict, for the World Bank viewers, he needs no introduction. He has had a very happening, tenure inside the World Bank. He has also worked in the private sector. He has an established background in public-private partnerships and infrastructure. What he does as program leader for India is to bring together the various strands of work which are being done by the World Bank from the various global practices and the cross-cutting solution areas. He brings together the different strands and different sectors, and he makes sure that everything is functioning well and moving together. And he also is a major or key, points person for the country as well, for the client as well, to connect to in terms of infrastructure and PPP financing. So before we go over to Sharmila to make her, keynote address to the audience today, I will ask Ben to say a few words on what he sees as emerging in India, what he sees in terms of his earlier experience and how it relates to what he sees happening now. And I would also like to remind the audience that we had on April 14th this year, the ex-Finance Secretary of India, Arvind Mayram, speaking on the evolution of the program. So we did see what had happened in the past. And today, Sharmila will progress that further and tell us what happened in the last few months and last 1 year since we heard from Arvind Mayram. Over to you, Benedict.
Yeah, thank you very much, Shyamala. And good evening, Sharmila. We're both in Delhi, by the way, so bear with us because it's pretty late here already, and some parts of the world as well, of course. I was not part of Arvind Mayram's presentation, so my apologies if there's a bit of an overlap with that presentation. I'm sure he explained in great detail about the PPP program of India. Let me put it in a historical kind of context. I think the India PPP program can be seen as a kind of play with four acts. And the first act is the impressive past. We'll spend a few words on that. The stressful present. We are in a situation that needs some kind of rethinking, and I'm sure Shamala will go into detail there. A kind of painful short-term kind of agenda we need to think about, and a gainful longer-term agenda. Let me explain. First, the impressive past. Over the past 2 decades, India has done extremely well in harnessing public-private partnerships to improve the level and quality of infrastructure services in various sectors. So private sector investments, for instance, in infrastructure more than tripled from the 10th plan period to the 11th plan period. And these plan periods, private sector investment share in total infrastructure investments increased from 20% to almost 40%. So that's very, very impressive. And today, private sector operators are serving 88% of the mobile phone users and owning 30% of the power generation capacity. Private sector is operating, constructing, or competing for nearly 20,000 kilometers of national highway network, spanning about 70,000 kilometers. And they are also operating world-class airports in the 4 metro areas in India, and several container handling facilities at many ports in India. So that's very impressive. And India did extremely well in mobilizing infrastructure investments through private participation, ranking first in energy, in transport ranking also first and second in telecom, just behind Brazil. So, in a nutshell, you can say India's PPP program is a well-crafted reform effort, and the credit for this impressive track record goes to the government, the private sector, and the Indian banks and other financial intermediaries. So let me go to that's the last 2 decades, still a few years ago. Then the stressful present is kicking in. Over the last couple of years, the story of private participation in infrastructure is showing some signs of stress and even distress in some sectors. For instance, a large portion of the private power generation capacity is lying idle for lack of fuel linkages, for instance. And several highway PPPs are facing delays in land acquisition and in obtaining environmental and other statutory clearances. These challenges are significant for any infrastructure project, and in case of PPPs, they acquire an additional degree of complexity because of their negative impact on the commercial viability. So the consequent stress is showing up in many different ways, like tepid interest in BOT toll projects, calls for a relief in power projects, reported increase in stressed assets or non-performing assets with banks. So that's a bit the present, and I'm sure Shamla will go into that. So how can we get out of this newer situation and go to a short-term agenda? The challenges are complex, but are not that unusual. The bank has done a lot of studies in that regard in Latin America, in the Caribbean region, for instance, and it is difficult to have perfect contracts. Perfect contracts do not exist. Foreseeing all the events that may unfold during the entire life cycle of a project is impossible. So mid-course corrections are part of the game. So for instance, in Latin America, we found between 1985 and 2000 that 30% of the contracts of the projects underwent renegotiations, especially in transport concessions. And even more actually in water and sanitation concessions, where there were 70% of the concessions were renegotiated. So yeah, I'm not saying renegotiations is the way forward, perhaps when we can think about it. So that these workouts, these renegotiations will be challenging. Maybe, of course, or will be contested by someone or other, but are likely to be eventually dealt with. So you need to do something about those contracts. What would be more important is what we learn from these experiences that could help us further fine-tune the PPP policy in the regulatory framework, extend perhaps the application of the PPP approach beyond highways and power. This is, I think, very critical for gainfully harnessing the potential of PPPs in the longer term. And here I have some ideas and some food for thought. And I see that from a certain distance because I'm working here in India, but I'm not directly involved in the nitty-gritty of the policy making like Sharma is doing, of course, but take this as friendly advice. 3 points here. I think there's perhaps a growing skepticism as to whether PPPs are delivering better, more correctly, optimal value for the government and its citizens. A particular area of concern is the risk sharing under existing PPP concessions, and perhaps PPP concessions is biased in favor of the private sector. In good times they're keeping the upside, and in bad times they're simply expecting to be bailed out by the government. Government should inform this debate through a review perhaps of PPP experiences in key infrastructure sectors like the highways, the airports, power, distribution, and widely disseminate what has worked and what has not worked. Such better, deeper understanding would perhaps be key to fine-tune the government's strategy to ramp up the private sector's share in infrastructure to 50%, as is it was indicated and agreed upon in the 12th plan, and to get broader support for and public support for the PPP mode, because I think perhaps there is a bit of indeed that word skepticism towards PPP emerging. Second thing is, I think, at the operational level, more attention needs to be paid perhaps to the post-award of phase of PPPs to ensure that they are indeed delivering the expected levels of performance. For this, the public sector could bolster its capacity for timely fulfillment of its own obligations, such as land acquisition, and also for effective monitoring of PPP through its life cycle. The third challenge, and then after this I will give it to Sharmila for her presentation. The third challenge is, I think, is to expand the repertoire of PPP approaches. Till now, the PPP space is dominated by concession structures that are predominantly rely on user fees, and the second category is discrete projects, with the notable exception of course of the National Highway Development Project. So with the benefit of 2 decades of experience worldwide, PPP practitioners are now converging to a view that the real benefit of PPP is not in mobilizing additional resources, but in bringing about investment and operational efficiency. This insight is key to expand the use of PPPs in delivering better infrastructure services in sectors and areas where people may not be able to pay the full cost of service, but the government is willing to pick up the tab to promote growth, to promote inclusive growth. For example, availability-based PPPs, commonly known as annuity-type PPPs in India. They could be very useful in increasing access to rural areas, social services, health, education, and skill development, this kind of social development kind of projects. In similar vein, pursuing PPPs in sector-wide programmatic approach is yet another powerful idea that has served India extremely well in the National Highway Program and merits, I think, perhaps replication in other sectors. So these are my first thoughts on the India program in a nutshell, and I hope this gives some food for thought for the audience. I will give it to Sharmila for a splendid presentation, of course, on the PPP program. Thank you very much.
Shamla, should I take over? Can you hear me, Shamla?
Yeah, please go ahead, Sharmila. We are all waiting for your presentation.
Yeah, good evening, Shamla. A pleasure to see you again, and hi, Ben. I would like to sequence the presentation largely based upon the structure that you see on your screen, but I'll also tweak it a little to respond to what Ben has just said. Just a second, we're trying to, yeah. How we'll do it is, I'll first talk about how project finance fits in the macroeconomic scenario in India. Then I'll explain what has happened in the last few years, which has led to what Ben calls the stress or the distressed project. The overview that we have in government now of infrastructure investments. Then I go on to the PPP specific issues. Let's start first with the project finance trends in India vis-a-vis the rest of the world. Ben has also already pointed out that we've had a fairly impressive track record in raising money for project finance in India. We rode the crest of an economic boom where our GDP growth rate was galloping. Compared to our peers and to developed countries, we were doing extremely well. Thereafter, we went to a period where there were some signs that the macroeconomic indicators were not doing too well. Our GDP growth slipped a little bit. Compared to anywhere else in the world, we were still doing remarkably well. But where we see our potential growth rate at between 8 to 10%, anything below that we see as a disappointment. The good news is that this lasted for only about 2 years. And last year, we clocked 7.3%, and this year we seem to be doing reasonably well. What has happened in infrastructure is that we had very ambitious plans when we came into what then referred to as a 5-year projection. We had projected a share of GDP for infrastructure investment in the current plan, which lasted 2017, of 10%, but we were hit by the global macroeconomic slowdown between 2011 and 12, so we still haven't reached those figures. We foresee that we will possibly hit that towards the last part of the sorry, we're just running into problems with the wire. Infrastructure needs are spread across all sectors. I just want to correct one thing that Ben has spoken about. The telephone and what has happened on the mobile telephony side has been entirely by the private sector. There's no PPP involved in that at all. It was just facilitation by the government. But our requirements in other areas are, I'm sorry, I think the hyperlink is, you just have to bear with me. We are trying to get the hyperlink. Okay. We've revised our projections in infrastructure. I keep talking from one of you to this. One of the requirements that we have foreseen in Shamla, you just have to give me a second. The hyperlink doesn't seem to be working. Okay. One of the problems that we have faced is there's a general tendency to mix the problem of infrastructure with the problem of PPPs. PPPs are a small subset of infrastructure. At no point did government ever envisage that PPPs replace either public sector expenditure or take over where the government has to spend money. PPPs in the end depend on a lot of issues, including the market, which includes the kind of macroeconomic growth we see. Plus, in India, project finance is slightly different from how you view plain vanilla project finance abroad. I think this has been documented also. In India, project finance involves an element of relationship management also. Most project finance is financed by public sector banks. Our public sector banks do tend to look beyond the specific project non-recourse funding to their relationship with the corporate. This has actually worked very well in India. The flip side is if you have a few large corporates who are all over in every sector, If they get over-leveraged at the parent company level, there will be stresses in raising finances later. In PPPs, what has happened is, when we started off, and this is a brief recap for those people who did not hear Dr. Mayaram's extremely eloquent address on PPPs a few months ago, and Ben had mentioned that it hadn't. When we started out with PPPs, we started mainstreaming it about 10 years ago. There were 4 or 5 areas that we had addressed in our mainstreaming. One is that there were various policy and regulatory gaps which we had to look at. We were very keen on having independent regulators as far as possible to give both the private sector and the government the confidence that there was going to be a neutral umpire when there were issues that were being raised. We realized that capacity building was required across all stakeholders. Ben had mentioned this in his opening remarks. This included government, it included the private sector, it included the financing bill, that is a financial institution which had to be introduced to PPP. It also included the body of consultants who are absolutely essential for PPPs. We also had to look at the possibility of asset liability mismatch because we didn't at that point have long-term funding for infrastructure. And lastly, I think this is one of the key factors, the need to mainstream the thinking in the public, including on the user pay concept, where the private sector will get a profit for the projects that it undertakes through PPP. How we had done this is we instituted a very, very clear institutional mechanism for processing. We have at the central government level, we have a federal structure and the government of India manages certain sectors of infrastructure. We have a very good system of almost seamless processing of project approvals above a certain level. There is a delegation of financial powers, and projects of a certain ticket size come to the PPPAC. That is a committee that is overseen by my ministry. Over the last 9 to 10 years, we have seen projects, we have seen close to 300 projects coming here with huge size. You can see on the screen the amount of money in US dollars that we have approved over here. We have also developed model concession agreements. I know that there is some criticism of this, of having straitjacketed templates, but this is not intended to be a straitjacket which binds departments to any structure that is not suitable for a project. The model concession agreements basically take those clauses that are virtually standard across all projects, including the legal requirements of drafting these projects. These model concessions have to be adapted to a project-specific requirement. This has helped roll out, especially in the highway sector, a large shelf of projects. We have tried to institute independent regulators as far as possible. This is still a work in progress. We have instituted something called the Viability Gap Fund, which Shamla is very familiar with, to have a system where in the initial construction years when projects are still to build up their revenue streams, we can add a grant funding element from the government to make these projects commercially viable in the long run. The approvals that we give from the central level are matched by contributions from projects in the state level. We have cleared over 200 projects in this, again, the statistics are on the screen for you to see. We have also rolled out a scheme for capacity building in PPP across all government levels, at the state level and at the federal level. We have instituted a project development fund which helps and handholds states and departments which are not very okay with how to develop PPP projects. We test them also. And Ben had mentioned the need to mainstream other sectors also. How we do it is, and I'll come to this later in the presentation, in the Department of Economic Affairs where I work, we test pilot projects, we bid them out, and if they see commercial success, then we go on to mainstream this by putting out model documents which can be adopted by any department. Shamla had mentioned the IIFCL. This is a government venture that was put in primarily to look at infrastructure takeout finance. We have also introduced various measures to attract investors to PPP financing. The problems that Ben has spoken to actually resulted from two things. One is that traffic projections in a lot of projects didn't go the way we had anticipated. The distress that was faced in certain sectors is actually not as large as it's made out to be. In the road sector, they were actually in a portfolio of about 300 to 400 projects. There were only 32 projects that were actually stressed. And this was a combination of two reasons. One is in areas like ports where you expected to see very good port traffic, we were hit by a series of issues relating to the kind of traffic that was realized. Simultaneously, on the government side, we found that there were delays on the clearances, which again has been referred to. We have streamlined the system. We have a body now that oversees clearances to ensure that the conditions precedent of government are met before projects are bid out. On the other side, and this I know that I have a time constraint, so I'm just going on to the topic of today, that is project financing issues. Again, I think we are skipping. Go to the slide. Okay. What I will do is, while we are getting the presentation online, one of the things that we have done is we have tried to introduce new financing vehicles which would incentivize long-term investment in infrastructure. We are still unable to get the slide on. Okay, yes. Okay, I'm not going to move to the other.
Sorry, this is Xavier. It seems that there is some sort of problem with your connection with the control of the presentation, right? Can you just move the presentation to the slide that you want to see and then click on the button that you have right below on the right side that says sync, the synchronization?
Yeah, we've done that. We keep syncing it and it goes back to the old slide.
Which slide do you want to see? I maybe we can control this.
This is on steps taken, which starts with expedited. It's right now on the screen, and it keeps skipping back to the hyperlink for some reason. Anyway, let me. Okay, no, yeah, this is the one. Okay, now no problem. I think you'll have to check on your side why this is happening. Okay, let me talk about the infrastructure debt funds. These are basically takeout instruments that we have introduced. These are non-banking financial companies that buy out the debt from banks. In India, we have faced the problem that most of our public sector banks have reached their sector exposure limits, and the company exposure limits were lending to infrastructure is concerned. We needed to see a churn in the investment. The infrastructure debt funds that we have devised are a hybrid of the kind of ideas that were fully private sector driven in Europe and the Indonesian model, which is fully government owned. These are facilitated by the government but set up by the private sector. We have 6 infrastructure debt funds that are currently running. They have each built portfolios of over $100 billion each. They're now looking to go abroad and raise long-term funding from outside. We have tremendous interest from long-term investors outside. We've also, during the last year, developed something called the Infrastructure Investment Trust, INVIT. This will do takeout of equity for the most portion and debt of infrastructure projects, and then these will be sold as units to long-term investors from abroad. These instruments were devised sitting across the table with the pension funds and endowment funds from abroad, which have been coming to India seeking investments in project and infrastructure finance because they know that the yields are good over here. We have simultaneously done something that Ben has referred to. We can do only so much of financing initiatives, but we also need to simultaneously look at project implementation issues on the government side. The first thing that we have done is that we have looked at renegotiation of PPP contracts. We realized that when we went into PPPs 9 to 10 years ago, neither party was prepared for being locked into an arrangement over the next 20 to 30 years. We do realize that there are some elements that will arise over 20 to 30 years that need to be relooked at. We simultaneously understood that there's a moral hazard in renegotiating a contract because in PPPs, in the end, what a financier looks at, the only bankable thing he has is the concession agreement. So breaking a concession agreement is not something we support, but we instituted a study building up on the body of knowledge that has developed, including over from experiences in Latin America. And we have issued a guidance note which is available on our website and anyone is free to look at it. The renegotiation triggers that are recommended in long-term PPP contracts. We are currently working on the legal clauses that would require to be drafted for this, and we expect to issue them shortly, maybe in the next 5 to 6 weeks. The other issue that Ben had mentioned that is the post-contract monitoring by authorities. This was an area that we felt needed some amount of strengthening. So over the last year, we have issued guidance notes and templates for contract management on the authority side in 2 sectors, that is in roads and ports. These are also available on our website and anyone is free to access them. The third thing that Ben had spoken about was rebalancing of risks in PPP contracts. There's an expert committee that is currently looking at precisely this issue. This was announced in our last budget. We expect the reports to be presented to government in the next 5 weeks by the end of October. This has done very wide-ranging consultation with all stakeholders, including financiers and consultants. The remarkable thing is the willingness of all parties to work together to look at a structure that works for India. In India, we realize that if we don't work on this today, we will lose about 2 to 3% of our GDP growth. So we realize the urgency in addressing this. The issues that have come up, and I think this would be universal across all jurisdictions. One is the importance of having a very robust dispute resolution mechanism. Right now, the tendency is for both parties to dig in their heels and fight to the finish. At some point, when we look at the larger need to deliver infrastructure projects and staff services, we need to have very finite timelines for dispute resolution. This is something that we will, the committee is looking at very seriously. The second issue is how do we look at improving the confidence that risks that are not within the purview of the private partner are taken on by the government. Whether this would entail, as far as possible, doing projects that are very risky through an EPC mode of delivery and then monetizing them when they stabilize. This is something Ben had also spoken about. Otherwise go into an annuity structure. The road sector is already experimenting with this. We are simultaneously looking at the possibility of monetizing brownfield assets, which are already doing well. India knows that it has a huge amount of infrastructure credit that is already lying in the books of the banks. I think at a rough count is this is about $266 billion, and with Basel III capitalization requirements kicking in next year, over 5 years we expect to see about 33 trillion requirements, with 33 billion requirements in addition for banks for capitalization. Given this, how can we best de-risk projects and how can we monetize that projects that are stable? We are looking at various options for this. We are looking at options also to do credit enhancements to improve the best project to a level where they'll be virtually risk-free for long-term investors. These are things that are going on as we speak, and the capacity building on all sides is also being rolled out. We do have a problem in that we need capacity building also on the private sector side. The initiatives that the private sector has to take within itself to look at this is something that we are working on. And I will end my presentation on one issue which Ben has spoken about, the need to broad base the PPP initiatives that we're taking, moving away from the hardcore structure. We have a series of pilot initiatives that we are currently looking at, and I think this will satisfy Ben's need to move into areas which are beyond the traditional PPP. We are looking at renewable energy, waste to energy, areas like cleaning of the environment. We are looking at rural hospitals, rural roads. There's a huge variety of projects that are being tested. We have huge amounts of bigger interest in this, but the issue is a pilot project normally takes a long incubation time. We from drafting of documents to actual signing off on the successful bid, it sometimes takes about 1 year. But thereafter, things are on a roll, and we roll out precisely what Ben has spoken about: schemes. Once we have implemented and tested something, we roll out schemes. Shamla, I will stop at this stage because I know we are running out of time, and I can take any questions you have on this issue. If that's okay.
Hi, Sharmila, thank you very much. And it was great listening to all that India is doing. And it appears that sectors have expanded now in terms of projects coming in. Project modes have expanded. You just don't have, one standard type of PPP. It's a lot more that you're seeing because risk allocation basically has to change as you see, the program evolving, the same as well as the economy evolving. But it's good that the GDP growth is picking up, and it's also good that the government is experimenting so much. Contract management, of course, is so intimately related to the confidence that is there on both sides, the public as well as the private sides, and this will affect project financing quite a bit. And talking about credit enhancement, we will be looking forward and looking at the new instruments that India is going to bring. It has experimented with a different, a whole different set of things, and the world learns, as you know, the world learned from India as far as the VGF was concerned, and the world is still learning and watching how the program will build up. And capacity building, you've touched upon that, and this I do know that India has been doing this for quite some time. In 2010, they did roll out a huge capacity building program, and it's good that you're paying so much of attention to it. Ben, what would be your take on all of these issues that you highlighted have been addressed by Sharmila? So how do you see this progressing? Do you think there's a hope that the confidence of the investors, which had taken a bit of a beating, do you think it will come back again and projects will be bid out much faster? Ben?
Hear me? Yeah, can you hear me? Can you hear me?
We can. It's a little distant.
Okay, okay. So I thought I was. No, thank you very much, Sharmila. This is a very nice overview of the situation going back in time and where we are right now. It's a very good overview, and not only that, it's also giving a frank kind of overview, a very honest kind of overview, assessment of where we are in India on the EPPP program. And as Shyamala was saying, everybody is looking at India, to India. Okay, you have a wonderful, great program, and there are issues. There is stress in the system, but how do you address this now? So a lot of countries can learn from that, and it's up to India and also to the policymakers how to deal with that. And I'm very encouraged to hear from you that you're looking in all those aspects. And yeah, let me pick three. I heard three main messages actually coming out of Sharmila's presentation and referring to the work that's being done by Ministry of Finance and other parts of the government of India. So first of all, is looking at the existing portfolio. What is going wrong there? Yeah, I would say it's stabilizing the existing portfolio, perhaps. Looking at the public sector banks, you mentioned that a few times. The State Bank of India is under pressure, and I think the latest data coming from the RBI is also indicating that the stress and exposure to the infrastructure sector, the NPAs, is yeah, perhaps it's not that bad as you may believe or is believed. So you mentioned a few words on that. I hear you, but NPAs are NPAs, and today was an article in the Financial Times exactly about that. You may have seen it, also referring to the Basel III requirements, recapitalization of those public banks. So a lot of billions need to go in. Moody's had an assessment, Fitch had an assessment ranging from 15 billion to 30 billion is needed to recapitalize the public banks. Yeah, you can say, what has that to do with the PPP agenda? It has a lot to do with the PPP agenda, because the money, the funds need to come from those banks, and those banks are underwater, perhaps. So I'm glad that this is being seen and recognized as an issue. How big it is, we don't know for sure. That's also the question on the table. How big is the problem actually? The second bucket or second element I heard you saying very nicely is I would describe this recalibrating the model and see if other methods or the existing model PPP approach can be fine-tuned to some extent. So more pragmatic, less dogmatic approach to choosing between PPP models. You mentioned the model concession agreement. That was a key for success. Very, very helpful, very instrumental for the success of the PPP program in India. But perhaps also a bit of a straitjacket for the program as well at the same time. And we can see the limitations of that. I'm glad that there is some kind of recognition for that, and looking into methods that would go beyond the existing cost recovery fee kind of approach, the toll kind of approach. And the third element, I'm very much on your side, the capacity building. I heard Shyamala also mentioning this, capacity building. And I would describe it a bit different, but it's the same issue. Reform the institutions. Because there is need for better project preparation, more need for contract management. The programmatic approach is a key for success. NHI, the NHDP was actually a kind of model to get to the higher level, to a big more PPP program. And I think more work needs to be done in capacity building with that kind of organization, not just NHI, just picking them up. But in the railways, for instance, there's not much capacity. You came from the railways, you know exactly what I'm talking about. There's a need for capacity building there. There's the Minister of Railways very keen to do PPPs, but there's not much capacity yet in the railways to help that, to support that agenda. So very, very much a lot of support is needed there. And I think the bank is very willing to help you there as well. With that, I think those are the 3 points I picked up quickly. There may be more, and I'd like to hear the audience also. With happy to answer questions too. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ben. And now we will go over to the question answer session. We have a few questions here. Some I think would be very difficult to answer. But I know, Sharmila, you love, challenging questions. So we'll start with one. It's about the water sector. We have George Butler, IFC water specialist, and he asks a question which, policymakers have been grappling with. And he says, do you think the gap in water funding is funding, regulatory, or a political issue? Sharmila.
Good question, and I think I have to be slightly careful in answering this. One of the problems that we have to deal with is whether we have the luxury of building up public opinion before launching PPPs in certain sectors. When we go to the user pay model, sometimes if we have the luxury of time, we need to get people on board before imposing PPP structures where there is no public financing coming in. But that being said, on the water side, we've had some remarkably successful models, and those of you who are in IFC are familiar with that. The self-help groups working together to give some support to a PPP project has actually worked very successfully. The model that we would adopt would be possibly either annuity. In some cases, like we have a hill station that we have picked up in central India, where most of the population is upper middle class or the affluent. These are the people who come in and go, and they are willing to pay a higher charge for getting uninterrupted good water supply. So the model that has been tried over here for PPP is this cross-subsidizes the water that is given to the other sections of the population which cannot pay for it. This has actually come out as a remarkably good structure. On the political side, we have found actually that there is no problem in terms of convincing the elected representatives that this is the way to go forward. But what happens in a functioning democracy like India is, around the time of elections, there is a certain amount of grandstanding which happens. It's normally a temporary aberration, but that does grab the eyeballs when you have a certain localized protest against the so-called PPP private sector model. By and large, these are normally handled, and one of the things that we do realize is that this is not something that a concessionaire has to cope with. This is something that the government has to cope with. The problem in mainstreaming PPPs in water is it's not everywhere that you can do a PPP structure because you may not have very viable bids coming in. So our approach in certain areas, and this is especially true in a huge country like India, where there are certain states and there are certain regions where you really wouldn't see a private sector wanting to come in and bid for a contract. In these areas, actually, the approach would be do PPPs in those sectors which have private sector interest and spend that much more public expenditure on the supplies that you give, say, for water for the areas that can't see investor interest. The last budget that was announced by the central government actually saw a thrust on public expenditure in these areas. Shamla?
Question. This is also, it's it's a tricky question again, I would say, but probably not for you. Mr. Bijay Kumar, he is, I know him too. He works in the government of Maharashtra. He was a former colleague. He says that the state of Maharashtra, which has been in the forefront in respect of having PPP projects, one-sidedly reversed its toll policy on 80 road projects executed under PPP mode of project financing, leaving as the only option for private investors to knock on the doors of the judiciary. So, as per your assessment, how is this incident impacting the environment of private sectors, for the private sector participation in PPPs? So how do you think, this decision of the Maharashtra government creates issues?
Shamla, actually, I think you've chosen your question very smartly because this is precisely what I was alluding to when I spoke about localized opposition to projects. This has actually shaken a bit of the confidence of the concessionaires. This is actually not a problem of PPP. It is a problem of law enforcement. It has to be tackled that way. If these are administrative measures that have to be taken by the local government, From my side, and I will limit my answer to the PPP financing issue, we realize that if there is such a risk, this can hugely hurt bidder confidence in PPPs, and this is an issue we are dealing with both in terms of the rebalancing of risk, how we look at it, and also the most important thing which the private sector looks at is protecting the cash flows in terms of NPVs if there is any kind of an incident which interrupts those cash flows. We look at the business model which was bid at the time when the contract award was made, but we realize the implications of this, and again, we feel that law enforcement is very important.
Right. Thank you, Sharmila. Ben, would you like to talk a little bit about both of these? How do you see other states in India, in the same situation? Do you see other states in India in the same situation, trying to reverse tariffs, change tariffs midway? What's your general view? You have the one vantage point. You are at the vantage point of a program leader. So how do you see other states working on this? Providing an environment which is consistent, providing policies, especially tariff policies, which are consistent, and no big surprises and bad surprises midway. Would you like to add something on this?
Yeah. Yeah, you can say India is India as a whole, but there are different situations, a different state in India, of course, and the PPP performance and attractiveness can be different in the various states. Gujarat is different than the Madhya Pradesh. And Madhya Pradesh is also standing out already compared to Kerala, for instance. And Karnataka has a PPP program as well. So you have to look a little bit at the state level how projects are performing as well. So it can be different state by state. But going back to Sharmila's point on law enforcement, that was one of my points in when I started my little presentation on sharing with larger audience, larger public, the benefits of the program so far. And I think it remains very important to keep hammering, keep repeating the benefits of the PPP program. You would not have those 4 airports, for instance, in India, if you would not have this PPP model in place. It's very important. It can be a bit of an obvious thing to say among ourselves. We know that, but the larger public is not aware of that. And for instance, in the more sensitive areas like water supply, is even much more needed. And there are good examples to share. So, and that's one thing I would like to encourage the government of India to keep disseminating good practices and keep disseminating the benefits of the PPP program. Not only important for India, it's also important for the rest of the world. The second thing is on, I saw a question popping up somewhere. There is no legal framework in India with regard to PPPs. That's a bit on extreme view. Of course, there is a legal framework. It's a different kind of legal framework. It's regulation by contract, we call it. The model concession agreements have been very helpful in putting in place a kind of environment for private sector involvement in the infrastructure. But there is a limit, of course, and we sometimes touch the limits of the legal framework in India. And as said by Sharmila, the dispute resolution is many times very, very challenging and very difficult. So more predictability in the system would be helpful. It would be very important for going to the next level with PPPs. The model concession agreement can help, but it would be important if at the government level, at the national level, at the state level, there would be more predictability in terms of managing this kind of contract. That's why we keep hammering that post-award phase of the PPP program. If we have more a kind of reliable, sound, predictable kind of system in place, how the government treats the oversight of the contract, then I'm sure if you have good examples of good oversight, then disputes can be managed much better. But it's putting in place a system that is more reliable, more predictable, and it takes time. I know that, but the elements are there. It's a matter of putting in place the capacity in the organizations, in the agencies, to let them perform in a more predictable, reliable manner. And a lot of effort is needed for that. Is that okay?
Thank you, Ben.
Should we?
Thanks a lot. And we are now starting to run out of time, but I'll ask Sharmila to answer quickly this another question, which is very interesting. This is about education PPPs. I know that these are picking up a lot everywhere, and even in India, we see some education PPPs coming up. Sharmila, there's a question from Shwetal Sindhwar. She asks whether there's been any monitoring or evaluation done on the education PPPs in India. So are these kind of relatively new, and is there some information and feedback coming in from in terms of the structures and how these are functioning, in terms of the performance also, especially the performance, I would say, of education PPPs?
We haven't had a large rollout of education PPPs as a scheme. We experimented with one structure where we were looking at the desert state of Rajasthan, a model where we would have a school set up in districts which have a very dispersed population and difficulty in for students to reach schools on a daily basis. The Right to Education Act was passed a few years ago in India, and the Ministry of Education is now rolling out a huge scheme of model schools through PPP. So it's premature to say how to evaluate it right now because we're still in the process of rolling this out. We've had a few individual efforts, not schemes as such, for education PPP. These have there was one that was recently done in the eastern state of Orissa, where we were trying to cater to the tribal population. We have the private sector already in a large way in school education, but that is more catering towards the urban elite. In rural areas, in tribal areas, we are trying to get new models of school PPPs. As and when we successfully do this, we will roll out the papers. And there's one thing I would like to say, and it also refers to something that Ben had said in summing up earlier. We have a vast amount of knowledge, and the most important thing that a lot of countries can learn from us is what not to do. Because I think it's important in PPPs to learn from mistakes made, then go on to the success stories. We have a very, very robust knowledge exchange program. We provide free help to any countries that require it. We have a lot of South American, African, and East Asian countries which come to us, and the Middle East of late, asking us for support in this. And even in education, we can share with you the structures that we have at any point that anyone wants. Shamla?
Now we have almost run out of time. We have a couple of minutes. This has been very informative, and before we end, I'd just like to say that it's so important that there is predictability, something that Ben as well as Sharmila have been reiterating. It's so important that the private sector gets what it has been expecting and doesn't have any nasty surprises. In fact, in a recent discussion, we even had some members of the private sector saying that it's okay if it's a bad environment, it has to be predictable. It's okay if it's not totally, in our favor and there are challenges that we will face, but it's important that it's predictable and the government keeps its promises. And the government of India is working on it. It's like I keep assuring many of my colleagues who think the India program is totally collapsing, that it is not. So India is a country with great resilience, and as you heard Sharmila speaking about it now, the program is going to pick up soon, along with the changes in the economy that you see. It's picking up. India has had a good run in terms of its budget surpluses, etc. It's not exactly a budget surplus. What I mean is its deficits are not so bad anymore. So we are picking up on all sides, and the PPPs are evolving. When I started working on PPPs in India, we had a very tight and very tight parameters to work with, and standardized contracts, which have now become a big problem in terms of the risk allocation that they prescribe. These are now becoming more flexible, or so I hope. So it's been very informative, Sharmila, and I think it's been good for the audience also, looking at the questions that we have been having. A very interactive session. Thank you so much. Thank you, Ben, for participating. And before we end, Sharmila, over to you for telling us in one sentence, what key message about the India PPP program do you want our viewers to take away at the end of this session?
I think thanks, Shamla. The most important thing is to disabuse your colleagues with the bank that the PPP story is collapsing. The infrastructure story has had stress. PPP has actually been the remarkable silver lining in this. The few projects that were stressed, for me, actually are a good test of the market. It's like a market testing of a model. So these few became too big to fail because of the sector exposure in this. PPPs have been the one consistent story in India that has succeeded. The work that we deal with in the ministry is proof of that. But we also accept that there have been mistakes on all sides. As PPPs mature in India, we will have to grapple with this, and it isn't as if the issues that we are grappling with now will be a one-time fix for all problems. As we move along, there will be new problems that will arise. But we foresee PPPs as being the way of the future, at least for the next 20, 30 years. We have no option for that. And I also want to end on one thing, whereas additional resources through PPPs is definitely something that we look at. The efficiency which Ben had referred to, efficiency and improved services, is something that we insist on. And this is where the contract management post commercial operations comes in, where we insist that the profit that we are paying to the private sector delivers improved standards, which is what will also convince users that yes, this is the thing of the future. Thank you, Shamla. Thank you, Ben. I enjoyed this discussion. Over to you, Shamla.
Thank you very much. Ben, in half a sentence, anything from your side before we end?
Thank you. No, thank you very much. It was a great pleasure, and thank you, Sharmila, for your kind words. I hear you. It's sometimes difficult to understand from an outsider's point of view what the PPP program in India is all about, but it's just fascinating, and I admire your stamina in terms of dealing with the issues. That's very impressive and a great lesson for the rest of the world, because what you have done is amazing. What's the problems compared to what you have done already? The problems right now are just small compared to what you have done already. So I'm very confident that you can address the outstanding issues and find a way forward for the PPP program. Indeed, I fully agree. PPP is the default option in India, and that it should stay like that. You should not move backwards to a kind of full public sector orientation. You did a wonderful job. Make sure that it works well, and just learn lessons and improve the approach. And with that, you're on the right track. Thank you.
Thank you, Ben. Sharmila, it's got now Ben endorsed everything that you have been suggesting. So let's hope we all work together and it'll be a great program. Thank you for participating today. Please come back next week for our next webinar, and this will be on global trends in project financing. Thank you so much.